Guys,
nothing to do with it.
So, I know you're all excited. It's very big happening. We're talking about it during stuff. But, so, is everyone some paper to flow with? Pens? Are you good? Alright. So, everyone just getting your stuff out, ready to go. So, we understand that you have had only one lecture on theory, despite that being an excellent lecture, if I say so myself. What's important to remember here that theory is exceptionally jargon heavy. There are tons of just like random words that you have to hear, where their meaning has like nothing to do with the meaning in English, but they have particular meanings in the debate round. So if you get confused, or if someone says a word and don't know what it means, please just pay attention. Especially pay attention to what comes immediately afterwards, because usually when we introduce new jargon content to the debate, there'll be an explanation of what that means immediately afterwards. So try to pay attention for at least for that long, and just don't get freaked out if you don't understand what's going on. After each speech, we're going to explain what happened, what the strategy was, what the arguments were. So take notes and flow to the best of your ability, and try to follow what's going to be happening in the theory debate and the arguments themselves. Okay, is everyone ready now? All right.
Is everyone ready? I affirm the resolution resolved. It is morally permissible for victims to use deadly force as a deliberate response to repeated domestic violence. First, questions of fairness are indeterminate and vague, and that we don't know exactly what we're being asked to evaluate. Not only is it unclear what it means for something to be fair, it's unclear just how fair the round has to be in order for us to be satisfied. Is any small advantage or disadvantage enough to justify a theoretical objection? If so, how do we go about determining exactly how fair a situation or an argument is? The lack of clarity in these questions indicates the vagueness and irresolvability of fairness arguments. As such, you reject appeals to fairness because they're impossible to evaluate. In addition, the affirmative should be given a chance to agree to debate under the negative's proposed interpretation. In other words, the negative should check with the affirmative during cross-examination to give them a chance to clarify their position in a more fair and equitable way. The affirmative case will serve to do two things. First, I'll outline a condition that's sufficient for me to win the round. Second, I'll prove that that condition is in fact true. In other words, the case will contain two sections. The first will set up what it means to affirm, and the second will demonstrate that those conditions have been met. As such, all I have to do to win the round is win one argument from the first section and one argument from the second. If I do that, I win the round regardless of the negative case. As such, section 1 is moral permissibility. I contend that if there are no moral rules, or if it's impossible for us to deduce morality, all actions would be morally permissible. This is true for a number of reasons. First, an action is morally permissible if there is no moral prohibition on that action. Raz clarifies, a person is permitted to perform an action if it is not the case that he ought to refrain from it. This is the best interpretation of permissibility because it's the most consistent with common usage. For example, we would say that an act is legally permissible if there is no law which prohibits it. In the same way, an act is morally permissible if there is no moral prohibition on that action. If morality is non-existent or indeterminate, then the notion of a moral prohibition becomes nonsensical, in which case proving a moral prohibition would be impossible and you'd vote affirmative. Second, moral permissibility is a kind of permissibility that has application when evaluating an actor that is capable of acting for a moral reason. That's true regardless of whether there are moral facts in this specific case or ever. That's true because it's appropriate to speak of moral permissibility even in cases that don't have moral weight. For example, it's morally permissible for Graham to sneeze, but suppose there is no moral consideration there whatsoever. The reason I'm using the term moral in front of permissibility is because if there were a moral reason for him not to sneeze, then we would call the action morally impermissible. This shows that it makes sense to use morally permissible to evaluate action even when there are no moral considerations at all. The reason for the lack of morality is irrelevant because we are talking about the capacity of an agent, not the morality of the situation. Third, to say that morality is non-existent implies that we know that the general form that morality would take. For example, We can say that unicorns don't exist, but we still know what the concept of a unicorn is. In the same way, we can employ moral terms without referencing the content of morality because we know what the general form of morality would look like. What this means is that we can still call an action morally permissible even if we don't know exactly what morality constitutes. So, to summarize the AC so far, my argument is that if there are no moral rules, or if it is impossible for us to prove the existence of moral prohibitions, then we would call all actions morally permissible. This sets up a condition for the truth of the resolution and an affirmative ballot. Namely, if I prove that there are no moral rules, or that deducing moral prohibitions is impossible, we would call the action of the resolution morally permissible, and you'd vote affirmative. It's important to understand how this shapes the burden of the negative. Essentially, in order to win the round, the negative has to do two things. First, they need to prove that the existence of morality is at all possible or coherent. Second, they need to justify a moral theory and prove why, under that moral theory, the resolution is true. Should they fail to do either of these two things, you'd affirm, because there would be no valid moral prohibitions on the action of the resolution. As such, the functional value criterion, and my only burden, is to prove that moral prohibitions do not exist. If I do so, I win the round. As such, Section 2 is moral skepticism. This section of the affirmative case will outline why moral prohibitions cannot exist. All moral claims are subjective and thus make truth evaluation of a moral statement impossible. Alistair McIntyre explains, an agent can only justify a judgment by referring to some universal rule from which it may be logically derived, and can only justify that rule in turn by deriving it from some more general rule. But since every chain of reasoning must be finite, such a process of justificatory reasoning must always terminate with the assertion of some rule for which no further reason can be given. Each individual has to adopt his or her own first principles on the basis of choice. The utterance of any universal principle is an expression of the preferences of an individual. Thus, all ethical claims fall back on ethical assertions and make the evaluation of moral truth subjective. The argument to McIntyre is incredibly simple. Essentially, all moral statements appeal to some standard by which we can understand them as true. However, the question of what standard that ought to be requires its own standard, which in turn requires its own standard, and so on and so forth ad infinitum. For example, the statement, all humans deserve rights, can be warranted by the claim that all humans have worth. However, that begs the question of why worth is important, how we determine which individuals have worth, and what worth constitutes. Each of the answers to those questions appeals to its own standard for justification, and our questioning of why can go on to infinity. As such, it's impossible to say that a moral statement is true or false in any meaningful sense, because that truth or falsity requires appeals to an infinite number of external, unjustified standards. In that case, we would say that it's impossible to determine things like moral prohibition, because justifying them would constitute a moral statement, in which case you would affirm because everything would be morally permissible. So, to summarize the ballot story of the affirmative case, an action is morally permissible if there are no moral prohibitions against that action. Therefore, if the affirmative proves that there are no moral prohibitions that can be determined, the resolution is true. This is explained by Section 1 of the affirmative case. As such, all I have to do is win one argument from Section 1 in order to grant me this. Section 2 explains why the determination of moral prohibitions is impossible. Specifically, because all moral statements are infinitely regressive and appeal to an infinite number of standards. As such, because it's impossible to determine moral prohibitions, the action of the resolution is morally permissible, and you vote affirmative. The final thing to note is the way in which the affirmative case interacts with the burden of the negative. Essentially, the negative has two jobs. A, to prove that the affirmative case is wrong and that morality can in fact have truth values, and B, to justify a moral theory and show that under that theory you would vote negative. Should the negative fail to do either of these, the resolution to be understood as true, and you vote affirmative. As such, I urge an affirmative ballot and stand open for cross-examination.
All right. So, this case is probably somewhat unusual, perhaps different from other things you've seen before. So, before we get into the actual arguments of the case, what was the first argument that Brian made? Yeah.
That there's no clear justification for fairness.
Yeah, that there is no way for us to resolve conflicting claims of fairness. That's very unclear, like how much fairness we need, what does it mean to be fair, something along those lines. So, why do you think Brian has made this argument at the top of the AC? Because it seems to not relate to the rest of the case whatsoever. Okay. So, that's a description of the argument. It is a preemptive theory. Why do you think he's making this?
Are you still on the next?
Yeah.
That way the negative doesn't have to say it's like unfair that he has to like prove that there's no prohibition doesn't.
Yeah, because the negative wants, well, perhaps the negative might want to run theory against this type of position. And if the negative wanted to do that and he's fairness as a voter, they would have to answer back this argument saying that we really have no idea what fairness is. So, can someone talk to me about why a negative might want to run fairness against this position? Someone who is non-realistic.
He set a lot of like burdens, I guess, on the negative, and kind of find a lot of like I don't know how to describe it, but gave himself a lot of advantages by saying that, you know, first of all, she can't even prove that commodity is real, and even if she does, she has to specify like you just set her with a lot of like complicated burdens to make it very hard to prove a resolution.
Yeah, so right above where he said my criterion is demonstrating that like moral rules do not exist. What was his explanation of what the negative has to do to win the round? Do you have an idea? No. Sure.
Yeah, you put a bunch of burden on what the negative has to do, so they have to prove that, like, first, moral rules actually exist, and then under that, they have to justify a moral theory that would, like, show how you engage or something like deadly force is not one.
Yeah, so the negative just did the first thing and showed why morality exists. And answered back the argument in part 2 of the AC. Would the negative win the round?
No.
Yeah, can someone explain why? Yeah.
So I guess trying to justify moral theories that make shit information.
Yeah, part 1 of the AC sets up how the negative has to show why there's a moral prohibition on the action. They just show morality exists. They tell us nothing but whether that system of morality would support or condone the use of deadly force. So essentially, the affirmative has placed what type of burden upon the negative? We talked about this in the video lecture earlier this morning. Even back.
Unnecessary but insufficient burden.
Yeah, this is a necessary but insufficient burden that the negative has to A, prove morality exists, and then make another argument as to how the resolution is false. Namely, that that system of morality would ban the use of deadly force. So, is anyone confused about what the argument is in the AC? Part 1. All right, so since you all understand it, does someone want to explain that part? Very briefly. Do you have an idea what it says? Yeah.
Basically, that there's like no way to tell what fairness is.
Can you speak a little bit louder?
Like he pretty much says that there's no way to tell what fairness is, much like morality.
So that was the first argument that the case was saying. That was specific to fairness. But then he said, so he set up that argument of fairness is very indeterminate. And then he said, set up that the AC is going to make 2 arguments essentially, like the part 1 and the part 2. So, what's your name? Yeah. What was it? Vivian. So someone want to help Vivian out and explain what the gist of part 1 was. Yeah.
That the negative has to do with part that morality exists.
Yeah, essentially. That if morality doesn't exist, then we would vote affirmative. Because there would be no moral prohibition on the action, because morality doesn't exist, so it can't tell us to not kill the abuser. Then, so what was part 2? Yeah. So what do you mean by that?
Like that morality or that we know.
Yeah, part 1 sets up if morality doesn't exist, then you affirm. There'd be no way to say you shouldn't kill people. And then part 2 says, well, morality doesn't exist. And it's the simplest way to explain the case. So can someone explain briefly what the warrant for why morality does not exist? This is is going from the McIntyre card and the exclamation immediately after. Yeah.
Because to justify anything, you have to ask why justification exists, or like what's the reason, and you get infinite whys, which leads to a question you find an answer for, which is like just because, and because won't be such a reason for Brown's existence.
Yeah, in order to believe a proposition, we need a reason for it. But that reason must have a reason that is true. So if you guys had like some phase when you were kids where whenever like your parents would say, well, you should go do that, like clean your room or something. You're like, well, why should I do that? They'd be like, because your room's dirty, it needs to be cleaned. They're like, well, why does our room need to be cleaned? Because they're like, because I want your room to be cleaned. And then you're like, why? And they're like, because I will make you do it. So you can always ask this infinite string of whys to a proposition, which means that we can never say morality exists. So and then moral rule need to have a justification for it. That justification needs a justification. But at some point in our lives, unfortunately, we'll probably have to stop talking about morality. So that chain of reasoning must be finite, it terminates, but then we haven't fully justified the rule. So morality doesn't exist. Okay. Are there any final questions about the case before we go into cross-examination? Yep.
Is it also abusive to set up, or is it possibly an abusive argument that you can make in theory that winning one of multiple standards in part 1 and one of multiple standards in part 2 is in and of itself a abusive setup for winning?
So there are multiple arguments for at least the first part. So there are multiple reasons as to why it really doesn't exist then you occur. So I think it's somewhat unclear whether it doesn't necessarily exist for us. But, so let's see if that gets clarified in any way. Alright.
Yeah.
So the premise of the affirmative case is that it's impossible for us to make moral statements, right?
Well, that's the premise of the second part of the affirmative case.
Okay, so let's start with the second part of the case.
Sure.
What is the warranted argument?
So that's the McIntyre. That explains that all moral statements are infinitely regressive, in that when we ask for a reason for something, that answer is susceptible to the same question, namely, why is that true? We keep asking that question over and over again, and we eventually arrive at something that is either assumed or is just a tautology, i.e. it is true.
So if I prove that McIntyre is incorrect, we can make moral statements, would that be sufficient, or would the judge vote for me?
No.
Why is
Because
that?
in that case, just because morality can exist, that does not mean that the resolution is not true, right? That does not
So
mean that
what
it
else
is
as
not
a
morally
negative debater would I have to do in order for the judge to vote?
So here's what you have to do.
Okay.
You have to, A, beat back the part of the affirmative case, the section 2, that explains why moral statements cannot have truth or falsity. Once you do that, you are free to set up your own moral framework and prove under that moral framework that the resolution is false. You have to do both of those things.
Okay. So let's say that you prove that moral statements cannot be true. Would that be sufficient for the judge to vote for you?
So long as I'm winning that in conjunction with the section 1 of the affirmative case, yes.
Okay. And if I propose some sort of moral framework and you win that, would that also be sufficient?
If I win that moral statements can't exist?
No. If I propose a moral framework after I win that moral statements can exist, and then under that moral framework you prove that it is morally permissible, would the judge be able to vote for you?
Yes.
Okay. So let's go back to the top of the affirmative case.
Sure.
So the first argument in the affirmative case is that fairness is vague, or
Yes.
some sort of okay. So what is the implication of this argument?
So my argument is twofold. First, it's really unclear exactly what it means to be fair or not fair. It's kind of this abstract concept that debaters talk about a lot. There's not really a way for us to quantify it. The second part of the argument is that even if we do know what fairness constitutes, it's unclear just how fair the route has to be.
So let's say that I spend 20 minutes in my next speech. Would that be an unfair thing to do?
Maybe, but it's unclear exactly how unfair that would be and how we would
Okay, so why do we
balance that
have
out.
to be able to quantify fairness? Like
Because the idea of something being fair is that it's equitable, right?
But would you? Okay, sorry, continue.
Just because you do something that's unfair, it's unclear just how unfair that is and how we would correct for that deficit, right? If we can't quantify it.
If we can understand that an action is unfair, why do we need to be able to quantify it?
Okay, so this is what I just explained. Just because we know that something is unfair does not mean that we know how unfair it is, right?
I understand. My question is, why do
So
we have
if
to
we don't know how
have
unfair it is, we don't know what action would solve that for them, right? We
Wouldn't it
don't,
make sense to just not take that action? Like, therefore, I wouldn't take 20 minutes in the next speech?
I mean, that would keep the abuse from happening, but that might not necessarily solve that for the abuse, just like you might still have to make theory arguments.
Okay,
something like
that's
that.
fine. Don't see us.
Okay. So, what did Emily learn from this cross-examination with Brian? So pretending, also pretending that you didn't hear us all talking about exactly what it was that the AC did. Come on.
There's no bright line to fairness.
Yeah, because you clarified, it's been a lot of process. I think about like half a minute, 2 minutes, clarifying this argument at the top of the case. So what does this sort of hint at as to what her strategy might be in the next speech?
Choose on theory?
Yeah.
Concerning the fairness of the
Yeah, spend a lot of time clarifying why fairness isn't a voter. You're probably going to make an argument why fairness is a voter. So, so I've been thinking a little bit about not so much the content of this first argument, but the strategic function that it has. So, let's say Emily wants to read this theory shell. She has to answer this argument in order to gain access to a fairness sort of voter. In the 1 AR, does Brian have to go for this argument? No. Why?
Because he already stated that in order for him to win, he just has to be win one argument from each part of the AC, which is one, show how morality, there's like, we don't know what morality is, like there's no prohibition.
Oh yeah, so that's the correct answer to my question. But I think I phrased it somewhat unclearly. So let's say Emily loves theory in the next speech and says, Brian is being unfair because I have these 2 burdens to win. He could even win under my moral theory that I justify. And that's unfair, so you should vote him down because he's making it very difficult for me to communicate. So, say Emily makes those arguments and then answers this argument about why fairness is subjective and we can't quantify it. In the 1 AR, does Brian have to go for this argument? That fairness is subjective. Yeah.
No, just drop that entirely. The theory has already been made and move on to extending his part 1, part 2 moral scale.
That's true. But if he just was like, oh, okay, I accept your theory arguments, I'm going to extend the AC now. What might the NR strategy be? Yeah.
Just as to run with the theory, since
Yeah,
you can see
because-
this fairness and
Yeah,
that's
you
how you
conceded
evaluate
fairness to
around.
the voter that it comes before substance and then just extended the AC, which was the substance that theory precluded. So that seems to be a very suboptimal strategy of just conceding all of the theory arguments. So, Ryan doesn't necessarily have to go for this argument of fairness is not a voter. So, in order to gain access to theory as an offensive argument, Emily has to beat this back. But in the 1 AR, Brian can simply suddenly realize that fairness is a very important principle of debate, and then just make arguments about why his case is fair. He doesn't have to go for this argument, but it is something that Emily has to answer if she wants to gain access to theory offense. So, earlier when we just started the AC, I asked why might this argument be there, and in this case, it seems like if the negative is going to go for, if you expect the negative to go for a theory argument against your case, this sort of argument in there means that your opponent has to spend time against it if they want to run theory. But that time would then be wasted if you just concede the argument. You can sort of hijack it, as some of your previous lectures have talked about, and sort of make that time your own because they've spent the time justifying the fairness voter, and you're like, oh, okay, fairness is important. Now, I'm going to show you how I am being very fair. So, we might see the strategy play out the next speech. Might not. But, and then briefly about what the negative construct is going to look like. Because this demo round is focused on the theory debate, the negative constructive speech is going to be shortened a bit. Because what Emily's strategy would usually be, would be to read a theory argument, answer the spike at the top of the EC, and then read a regular negative case, and make some answers against this skeptical position, But that's really not what we want to focus on in this lecture series because we're talking about theory, how to answer theory. So we're cutting out part of the negative case, or the negative constructive, so it's not going to read a case, it's not going to make answers to the TDC, but it's going to make the theory argument in about the same amount of time that she'd usually spend on that sort of position. So she will be dropping the TDC, but there's a reason behind it.
As a brief roadmap, we will begin by reading a theory interpretation shell, and then I will go on to address the arguments at the top of the beginning of the case. Ready? Is everyone ready? A is the interpretation. When met, all burdens imposed on the debaters must be sufficient for the debaters to win the round. B is the violation. My opponent imposes a burden on me that I must meet in order to win the round, but I cannot win the round by only responding to it. Namely, I must prove that moral statements can exist, but proving so would not be sufficient for the judge to vote for me. I must also prove that my interpretation of morality would prohibit deadly force. So, C is the standards. First, ground to generate offense. If the affirmative assigns burdens that must be met but are not sufficient to negate, I cannot generate offensive responses off of the arguments. All responses would only show how I meet the burden and can get access to other arguments. This destroys fairness since it renders all the time that the next man's answering the burden is useless, since the most I can win is defense. Ground to make offensive arguments is to keep fairness to give the negative a more equitable chance of winning the round. Second is reciprocity. Burdens that must be met but are not sufficient to negate create a structural inequity in the round because the affirmative wins the entire round if they win that one burden, while the negative has to beat back the burden and win other arguments to win the round. This destroys fairness because the negative will always have to do significantly more in the round to win, meaning that an affirmative debater of equal skill will almost always win the round if they run such an argument. And the third standard is time skew. These burdens create massive time skew in the round because the negative must spend time responding to the burdens proposed by the affirmative to have any chance of winning the round, while the affirmative can devote all their time in the next speech by just going for that one burden. This is especially harmful because the negative is not able to win the round just by answering the burden, and because the negative also does not get to set the burdens for the round. This destroys fairness because it prevents the negative from formulating a next strategy around the AC, which gives the affirmative a structural advantage by allowing them to invest a huge amount of time trying to win this one argument. So, part D is the voter. Theory is a voting issue for fairness because the role of the judge is to choose the better debater. If the round is inherently biased towards one debater, the judge cannot fulfill their role because any issue a debater is winning in the round couldn't be definitively attributed to his ability as a debater, but could rather be an effect of a structural disadvantage. Thus, theory must come first because unfairness disables the judge's ability to identify the better debater. Furthermore, it frames substance because it determines what can and cannot be run, and precedes an accurate evaluation of an argument's validity. Finally, the debater should lose the round for having the unfair argument because it will deter them from making abusive arguments in the future, which would further preferable norms within debate. If the judge does not vote against these unfair practices, then they will actually proliferate because of the favorable time trade-off in running these arguments. The loss is the only way to stop abuse. So, to summarize the theory shell, my opponent in cross-examination specified that I had to win my burden and to win a different burden in order to win the round, whereas he only had to win that single burden. That creates a trade-off because there are two ways for my opponent to win, but only one way for me. So, the theory shell sets up three different standards as to why this is unfair. But in order to determine why fairness is important, let's go to the affirmative flow. So, let's go to the argument that my opponent makes that fairness is vague. First, even if fairness itself is vague, we can understand when an action is unfair. For example, if I stood up, took my opponent's flows, tore them, and then smashed his computer, we would know that that would be an incredibly unfair action because it would prevent him from debating the round. So even if we don't know like when something is incredibly fair, when something is slightly fair, we however do know that something is unfair. Second, we can also evaluate fairness comparatively. When, for example, I can say that I am being more fair than my opponent because my opponent is placing burdens on me that make it much harder for me to win the round than it is for him to win the round. So therefore, if I said that we would both need only one burden to win the round, it could be easily understood that fairness, I would be the one being more fair within the round. Third, there is no warrant as to why fairness itself has to be quantifiable. In cross-examination, I had to ask my opponent many times as to why we would need to be able to quantify when something was very fair, when something was kind of fair. And he gave no clear answer. Absent this warrant, I can say that if I'm showing you why he is being unfair and why my interpretation is the better interpretation, then then the judge should be able to vote for me. And finally, saying my opponent making the claim that fairness needs some sort of bright line only concedes the fact that fairness is important. Because the internal warrant for this argument is that if there's no bright line, then it's impossible for him to determine, it's impossible and therefore unfair for him to have to argue against fairness itself. So this is a very circular argument because he's inherently conceding the authority of fairness when he's saying that we don't know why fairness is important. And then let's go to the argument right under this fairness, this vague argument that says that I should be able to clarify any arguments in cross-examination. First, in cross-examination, my opponent made it very, very specific that I would have it would be 2 times harder for me to win this debate than it would be for him. So I tried this, and he basically gave the violation for the theory shell. But second, this argument would require for me to ask an infinite number of questions within cross-examination because there are infinite number of different ways that he could try to be unfair. But obviously, it is impossible to ask an infinite number of questions within a 3-minute period. So, to clarify what happened on the AC, it gave you 4 or maybe 4 or 5, I'm not sure, reasons as to why fairness is vague is not a legitimate reason as to why you reject fairness as a voter. And remember that theory shell is predicated on the fact that because fairness is important, we have to be able to reject the arguments that my opponent is making and ultimately have the judge vote for me.
Okay. So, before we do cross-examination in the shell, let's go ahead and make sure you guys follow what's being said. So, can someone tell me what the exact wording of the interpretation was? Sorry.
I'm not sure I have it like word for word, but it's something like all burdens when met must be sufficient for the debater to win.
Must be sufficient for who?
Or the negative to win.
So would these arguments that the negative is making be not runnable as an affirmative debater? The negative, like maybe necessary this first to talk about the elections, where like yeah, the self-defense and the negative that you have to be proportional and imminent.
No, that's theory argument.
Yeah, so it seems like these arguments don't apply to just one debater. So someone know like what was clarified in order to, so what the explicit text of the interpretation is. Does anyone think they have something that's close to? Is that a hand raise? Yeah. Come on, do you want to give it a try?
I actually didn't get that part from the book. The interpretation is
Okay. So I want to try it.
All burdens for both debaters must be sufficient to win? Something like that?
Yeah, I think that captures most of it. The explicit text that I have is when met, all burdens imposed on the debaters must be sufficient for the debaters to win. So it's not specific to just like the after the neg, and it says that all the burdens, which is a burden is another word for like standard or criteria, because the way evaluating impacts determining why someone's won around, and since they all have to be sufficient. So, how does Brian's case violate that? Is your name Jared?
Yeah.
Do you have an idea what the violation was?
This is like, he has so many different ways that he can win while she has to prove that she is meeting both burdens and the fairness, and the fairness argument of dissolved proof theory.
Can you say that again?
Like, Brian has so many different ways that he can win in the AC, while she has to win both of the burdens Brian puts on her, and for her to run a theory show, she has to win the fairness argument of the
So I agree with your assessment that the negative has a lot of things to win on the burden structure from the AC. But does she have to win the argument at the top of the case.
To run theory, she does.
Yes, to run theory she does. That's an important qualification. I think we should take a moment to emphasize that. If the negative could presumably win by just accepting the ASP framework, arguing that morality exists, and then arguing deadly force is prohibited, so it doesn't have to beat back the theory argument at the top of the AC, she just has to beat it back if she wants to run theory. So do you understand that distinction?
Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah, that was a good clarification of the violation. There's a lot of things the negative has to do in order to win the round that the ASP really doesn't have to do. So, the first standard. Does anyone have what the text of the first standard is? Yeah.
Ground to generate offense.
Yeah, so how does the negative not have the ground to generate offense?
Because all responses that the negative will give to the burdens are only going to show how they meet the burdens, yet those will not be sufficient enough to win the round, only how they meet the burdens.
Yeah, so argument's pretty straightforward. If the negative just meets and shows that morality exists, they don't win the round. It's not offense. Why is having the ground to generate offense key to fairness? So we answered a lot of questions already. So, does anyone who has not answered a question yet think they caught the reason why, or could maybe extrapolate what the reason would be that ground to generate offense?
It's important to be able to generate offense because if you're never able to generate offense, all you're doing is proving why you don't lose instead of why you win.
Mm-hmm.
So you never have an opportunity to like win.
Yeah, you don't have an opportunity to win. And the winning part is an important thing. So what's the difference between an offensive argument and a defensive argument? Simple lineation. Yeah.
Well, an offensive argument is a reason for the judge to vote for you, and a defensive argument is a block against your opponent.
Yeah, an offensive argument lets you win rounds. Defensive arguments don't win rounds. So, if one side has many more ways to generate offensive arguments, but the other side only has defensive arguments, what would you say about those two debaters' chances of winning the round? Are they the same or different?
Different.
Different, yeah. Because one debater can make offense, the other really can't. So the second standard was one that we didn't get a chance to talk about in the lecture. So, does anyone think they have what this argument is? How about you know, Richard?
What was the question?
Do you have what the second standard was?
No, I missed that.
Yeah.
Reciprocity?
Yeah, so what's the argument in the reciprocity?
That the negative has a lot to do in order to win, whereas the affirmative only has to do one argument out of each section of your case.
Yeah. So that's the argument for reciprocity. So the phrase that people say is that arguments have to be reciprocal, meaning that both debaters need to have the same or equal sort of ways to get at it. So does someone know what the internal link of fairness is here? Internal link is another word for the connection between two arguments within some sort of like broad scenario. So in this case, the internal link means the connection between the standard reciprocity and the does anyone have a guess or what it might be, even if they didn't catch it as it was said? There.
Well, I think Emily says that like there's this structural inequity because the negative is always going to have to do more work because they have these conservative burdens, and so then that means that if the debaters are like equally talented, the app will almost always win.
Yeah, the negative simply has to do more work because their burdens are not reciprocal in the round. So you can't really adjudicate the better debater because affirmative is going to win based on that. So you and the red shirt name, what was your name? Sunir. So, can you explain what the second standard was that? So we sort of clarified.
It was reciprocity.
Okay, so what's the argument for how necessary and insufficient burdens violate reciprocity?
That the affirmative will have to win like one argument with the negative one long way.
And why is that important for fairness?
Because the affirmative doesn't have to, well, the neg has to argue, win along with arguments, which make it more difficult for the neg. And the app has to win just one argument, which is a lot easier.
Definitely. Yeah, so that was a good explanation of what reciprocity is. So, final standard, fairly quickly. What is times? I've answered a lot of questions. How about the person today? Yeah.
Their spend was times u, and basically saying that the negative is unfair. Unfair because the negative has to spend a lot of time answering the burdens and all the different road restrictions.
Yeah.
It's unfair.
So in any case, you would probably have to spend some time answering the affirmative construction. So, but what is uniquely problematic about this particular affirmative case? So if the negative invests all of their time just meeting the burden that proven morality exists, we already established that they would not win. So let's say the negative splits their time as evenly as possible, spends 3 minutes and 30 seconds making arguments that morality exists and by defining it in some form, and then spends the next 3 minutes and 30 seconds solely establishing that there's a moral prohibition on killing people. So they split their time in meeting their two burdens: one, proving morality exists, and two, proving morality would condemn the resolution of election. What does the negative claim that the 1AR should do? Or what do you think that the 1AR should do in this scenario? Yeah.
The negative claims that the 1AR can simply just stand up and go for one of the burdens and support itself, while the negative would then have the unreciprocal burden to answer all the burdens that the affirmative places on.
Yeah. The 1AR can just spend 4 whole minutes just dumping reasons why morality doesn't exist. In which case, that 3 minutes and 30 seconds the negative spent saying why, if morality existed, it would condemn the use of deadly force was wholly irrelevant, because morality just doesn't exist. It doesn't exist to make that type of claim, because we can always ask the infinite question, why? So, or the affirmative could simply go the other way, accept that morality exists, and then make a bunch of arguments about why that conception of morality, the negative endorsed, would actually affirm the resolution. So, what is the time trade-off there in that scenario? How long does the app have? So how much of the negative construction would the app have to answer? Jared. How much of the negative constructed would the app have to answer in the different strategy that is described?
As Emily said, that he could work under her moral framework to also win.
So does someone know how much time the negative would spend given strategy? Yeah.
You would spend 3 minutes answering one of her 3-minute arguments.
Yeah.
And the answer would be 1 minute.
And then how long would the app have to respond to that 3 minutes? 4 minutes. So in that sort of scenario, again, you can see how there's the affirmative is trying to reverse this time disparity that sometimes exists in LP. Well, it always exists. It speaks all at the same time. But the app is trying to get it so that they can have 4 minutes to answer only 3 minutes and 30 seconds of the negative constructed. So, do you think it would be beneficial for the negative given the AC, say that the negative didn't want to run theory, they just didn't like it or something? And if the negative split their time any differently, so perhaps they spend more time justifying morality or why morality exists, and then less time justifying why morality existed, then it would condemn the use of deadly force. Which part of that do you think the app would go for? Which one of the ways? So they have 2 ways they can win: demonstrating morality doesn't exist, or saying morality would condemn this particular action. Which one would the app go for if the neg spent more time meeting one and less time meeting the other? Someone who has not answered the question yet. You definitely answered the question. Well, how about the guy next? Did you answer the question? Yeah. Ah, that was unfortunate. What was your name again? Yeah. Shane. So how about you behind you? What's your name? Obina. Obina? Okay. So, which argument do you think that the affirmative is trying to attack in the one A? The one the negative spent more time on or less time?
I can hear you.
If the negative spent more time, meaning one of the F burdens, which is they placed upon them, like more time saying why morality existed, and less time saying why if morality existed, then it would come down to deadly force. Which one of those parts do you think the F would spend their 1AR?
The second one.
Yeah, the F would go for the argument that you spend less time developing. So almost no matter what, the negative is going to lose a large part of their time because they have to just ignore part of the debate and just talk about that. So that would be the violation for the time situation. So somewhat briefly, the arguments of the negative made against the affirmative case on these theory specs. So we talked already about the argument. The first argument was that fairness is very vague. And with a lot of arguments sort of think that cross-sects are like, well, we can just compare the amount of fairness, and some things are very obviously unfair, like punching Brian in the face. Probably not a good idea to try to run the debate around that way. But then he started responding to another argument that was directly beneath that. Does anyone know what argument she was responding to there? It's an argument sort of about cross-sects. Sarah?
So he made this argument in case about how like you can clarify your position in cross-sects or something, and like she had two responses to that.
Yeah. So the app said that if you want to run theory on me, you have to clarify in cross-sects, so I can tell you if I want to comply or conflict with your theory show. And so while Emily didn't explicitly say, like, well, I want to run this theory interpretation, do you violate it? She did clarify a lot of things about the burden structure in cross-sects that seem to fairly clearly indicate that he violates this particular interpretation. This might be actually somewhat more commonly seen justification for why. So it's somewhat very more common for people to say you have to clarify your violations in CX, which some debaters are somewhat like uncomfortable doing because they don't want to like give their opponent that much more prep time. But it seemed like Emily was still like fairly heavy-handed in that this is a necessary but insufficient burden, right? She never explicitly asked that question, but it did seem to be just getting at it very closely, which is still something you should try to do in conflict, because it sets up the violation very clearly, and she's able to make some very clear arguments about that. Do you guys have any final questions about the speech to negative? Okay, so everyone seems to be doing well on it. So then the 1AR is going to use probably more jargon that you've not heard in the previous speeches. So once again, just sort of try to follow along. They use the terms that you don't know. Just keep listening, and I'm fairly certain there'll be a definition almost immediately following it, or the argument following it will clarify what that means. Oh, yeah, cross-examination. That is important. All right,
Ready? So really quickly, explain to me what exactly your theoretical issue with the affirmative case is.
First, the interpretation that I am proposing is that if there are any burdens imposed on either one of us in the round, if we meet it, that ought to be sufficient for the judge to.
So what specific burden in the affirmative case does not meet this interpretation?
Okay, so in our last cross-examination, I asked you, if I prove that moral statements can be true, would that be sufficient for the judge to vote for me? And you said, no. And then I asked you, if I prove that under my interpretation of morality, if deadly force was impermissible, if that would be sufficient for the judge to vote for me. And so after that, you said yes. So that meant that I had two different burdens. The first one, to prove that morality could exist, and the second, to prove that.
Cool.
Okay.
So let's say that I have a different interpretation of how debate should work, right? I read that interpretation and I warrant it. Say I win that debate. What happens then?
Well, the interpretation or the shell that I read does not speak to that. So we could have that sort of debate.
Okay, so with that in mind, let's talk about the voter in this.
Okay.
The voter's fairness, right?
Yes, it is.
Why exactly is fairness important?
All right, so the role of the judge is to determine who did the better debater. However, if one of those debaters goes into the round with an unfair advantage, then the judge has no way to know if the arguments that he or she is making and the way that he or she is like stylistically debating is because of that person being a better debater, or if that person just had that sort of advantage.
Why wouldn't this apply to other advantages of existing debate as well? Like, say I go to a really small school and you go to a really big school. Why wouldn't that handicap go first?
I would say that the only sort of handicaps that the judge should be voting off on are the ones that occur in the round. So like the arguments that we each.
Fair enough. What's the implication of theory? Say you win the theory.
If I win theory, then the judge votes for me, because in order for abusive arguments like the ones that you're proposing for the case, in order for those to stop, the judge has to be able to vote for that debater who is proposing the better norm for debate.
Awesome. So your argument is that whoever proposes the best norm for debate should win the round.
Yes,
right?
that's my argument.
Okay, so that's my initial question. Say I propose a different norm for debate, and I prove that that norm is way better than the one that you're proposing.
That'd be hard.
According to what you just said, that would mean that I would win the round, right?
Yes, that would be better.
Okay, awesome. Let's talk about your specific standards.
Okay.
So the first one is just talking about you being able to generate offense on the affirmative case.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Why can't you do that right now?
Okay. So the way that the affirmative case is built up, or structured is that if I can somehow prove that moral statements can't exist, that's not an offensive reason for the judge to vote for me. That's just one part for the reason why the judge shouldn't drop me automatically. So then I would have to prove that, under these sort of moral statements, deadly force would be impermissible. So those are like two steps that I have to do proactively that aren't on the AC. So there's no way for me to generate any sort of offense on the AC that would be a good reason for the judge to vote for me. Just reasons why the judge shouldn't be saying that I lose.
Okay, fair enough. I'm starting from.
All right. So there was one major concession that Brian got out of the process. Can anyone tell me what that was? It was a huge issue. Yeah, thank you.
That if you could propose a better interpretation that sets a better norm
Yeah.
for debate,
If he wins a better interpretation, then he should win the round. So, this is an issue that a lot of people face when confronting answering theory is, well, so you made all these arguments, but how do I win the round based on your own, through your own shell? Because it seems like if the argument was that Emily first presented it in cross-sex, that she didn't really know whether Brian winning a better interpretation would mean that you win the round. It would seem like that's almost placing a necessary suspicion burden on the person defending themselves from theory. Can someone explain why that would be the case? Yeah.
Because if she had made a concession, it would be paradoxical, because then she's saying, okay, you have to beat back my theory to win, but beating it doesn't mean you win. Which would be paradoxical because she's still like that.
Yeah. Well, a common argument people make is that, well, if you just show, oh, you're not breaking the rules of the game, that doesn't mean you should win the game. Just like in a sports game, if someone says, doesn't say, oh, well, I just didn't follow you on that play right there, I should get a point for that. That would be sort of strange. Because just following the rules doesn't necessarily seem to be a reason to be rewarded. But it seems like there's a unique distinction to be made, especially with this particular show. Yeah, okay. So, does anyone understand how it might be sort of strange to run this theory shell and claim that them beating theory shell is not a reason to vote for you? So, what was your name? What was it? Hijacking. So, I think you gave a good explanation of that, but we'll make sure everyone's on the same page. So, can someone explain why that was the case. And so rearticulating his argument to make sure we're all together on this. Was everyone able to hear what he said? I guess some people did not hear. You said you couldn't really hear what he said?
No, I couldn't.
Okay, do you want to try and re-articulate what his argument was?
What was the question again?
So, how might this theory shell itself be construed as a necessary but insufficient burden?
I'm sorry?
How might this theory shell be construed as a necessary but insufficient burden?
Because of the fact that it's saying that meeting it wouldn't be a reason to vote.
Mm-hmm. So what would the app have to do to win that?
Not sure.
Okay, do you want to go for it?
The app would first have to answer why they meet the theory shell, or why whatever they do is going to be better, and then also go back and win the affirmative case.
Yeah. So the app would also have these two sorts of burdens. That's a very common way of warranting why we should consider theory two-way street is the way some people talk about it. That if the person who has theory run against them wins a better interpretation, then they should win the round. So, but I want to focus on the particular way that Brian got Emily to make this concession. So he didn't say, well, I have to beat theory and win the case, right? Because that was going to be sort of very upfront about what you're doing. So he asked her to explain which part of the theory shell came right before this concession. Does anyone remember that part of cross-X? Okay. So it was a whole 2 minutes ago. You can see why you forget that. So the part right before it was explaining the voter. Does anyone remember sort of what Brian got Emily to talk about, which is explaining the voter? So, does anyone want to try explaining the voter itself? Yeah.
Wait, do you want me to explain the voter or where he got at?
Preferably where he got it.
He was saying that one of the voters was talking about fairness in general and how was it his argument? Was it when he asked her what about why doesn't it apply to other different types of unfairness standards in debate?
Can you explain that a little bit more?
Where he said what if I go to a big school and you go to a small school? That's inherently unfair, I would suppose.
So that was part of what he was talking about with the voter, but I don't think that was the direct segue into the concession he got. That wasn't right before.
Okay.
Yeah.
Was it the evaluation she said where out of round impacts don't matter, the only thing there's allowed to weigh is what happens in the round. And what you can get out of that is, so if you're only evaluating what happens in the round, then your own theory shell is saying nibs are bad, so you shouldn't be able to make that interesting.
So the argument that we don't talk about wasn't what led into Brian's concession of crossings. But so very briefly, what was your name again? GQ. So he used a phrase called nib. This is a phrase you'll probably hear in debate, even if you don't really like it. As Andy, he everyone thinks. So the phrase is an acronym for necessary but insufficient burden. So when someone says the phrase nib, that's what they're talking about. The necessary but insufficient burden. So that wasn't the way that Brian got Emily to admit that across. That's a very common way people go about making this type of argument that I should be able to win by beating the theory argument. But it's a very common way of doing it. So part of what I think may have gotten Emily to concede this point is that it's not really what people are used to approaching this particular argument. So does anyone remember what it was about the cross-examination question that got Emily to it? So what is the point of the fairness vote? It's saying that, well, I have this interpretation for debate, and I think it's a really good thing. So you should vote for me because I'm endorsing this interpretation. Do you try and clarify what the way for Brian got his concession was?
Oh, he basically asked her if he could provide a better interpretation. Would that win him the round?
Yeah, essentially the entire logic for a theory shell is that I have this good rule. Vote for me because I have this good rule. And Brian was like, yeah. So if I provide a better rule, don't your own arguments mean that you should vote for me because I'm providing a rule that is a good thing for debate. So that seems to be very clearly. So that's very clearly how Brian got that concession from Emily and Cross. The jargon phrase that you will hear people use for this term is RVI, which is another acronym that stands for a reverse voting issue. So you should all write that down specifically. RVI equals reverse voting issue. And what a reverse voting issue is you reverse the voter, essentially. That if the person defending themselves from theory, wins the theory debate, i.e. someone has been called out for being unfair or uneducational, and they're like, actually, I have this better rule for debate, and I'm fulfilling this rule. That means that I am being fair and educational, so I should win the round. So that is the phrase RVI refers to, and that is the important concession that Brian got from later. Second, does anyone have any final questions about anything that's happened so far? Is that a question? Okay. All right, let's bring some on here.
All right, so I'm going to start by reading a different interpretation and justifying that interpretation, and then we'll do the interpretation that Emily read and talk about it. Is everyone ready?
You might want to briefly mention how someone should flow.
Oh, sure. So this new interpretation that I'm going to read, you probably want to flow on a separate sheet of paper because you're going to be flowing my responses to Emily's shell next to where you flowed first. Does that make sense to everyone? So you're going to want to flow what I'm about to read on a new piece of paper. Then when I answer Emily's shell, you're going to want to flow my responses right next to where you flowed your shell. That makes sense? So like, no, she's only
Frankly, it's not a matter of preference. Just flow on a new piece of paper.
Yeah. Understand that? We're good? Good job.
So you should have 3 pieces of paper. One being paper in case, one being Emily's theory shell, and the third one is going to be filled up by the area provided.
Is everyone clear on that? Is everyone ready? A is the counter-interpretation. Debaters may each establish one and only one necessary but insufficient burden. B, I meet the interpretation. C is the standard. First, consistency with the text of the resolution. Necessary but insufficient standards are most relevant to the way that statements like the topic actually work, insofar as any kind of truth statement is dependent on a number of assumptions, and debating on the level of those assumptions is most consistent with the text of the resolution. Textuality is key to fairness, because if an argument isn't adherent to the text of the resolution, then there's no way to adequately prepare for it. Essentially, it would be obviously unfair if I read an affirmative case and Emily stood up and talked about how the healthcare bill in the Supreme Court should be struck down. So that has absolutely nothing to do with the topic, and there's no way for me to predict those arguments. Furthermore, textuality determines what is or isn't fair, because what is fair or educational on any given topic is determined via textuality. For example, what's fair on this resolution, or a fair affirmative case on this resolution, may not be a fair affirmative case on other resolutions. As such, before we ask the question of whether or not something is fair, we should ask ourselves the question of whether or not it's consistent with the text of the resolution. 2, stable ground. A necessary but insufficient burden is literally the most stable piece of evidence that I can generate because A, it's not at all dependent on their lived story, and B, the messy debate that tends to happen on substantive issues can't taint the debate that's happening here. Stable advocacy ground is key to fairness because an unstable advocacy makes me into a moving target, skewing Emily's strategy and making it impossible for her to make cogent responses to my arguments. Moreover, Stable advocacy ground is more important than any other theory standard, because even if the round is reciprocal, for instance, if advocacies aren't clear and stable, it's impossible for either debater to make arguments. Subpoint D is the voter. You can crossline the fairness voter from Emily's initial shell here. We both agree that fairness is really important. The question now is who is proposing the most fair interpretation. With that question in mind, let's go to the shell that Emily uses. Start off on the violation. I say that even if I might be violating on a technical level, there's actually no abuse here. The reason for this is clear. In any debate round, a debater that justifies a moral framework has to overcome the problem of skepticism. Namely, they have to give warranted reasons as to why their moral framework is true. If they're not doing that, then they're not doing their job of setting up a moral framework and of establishing what it means for them to be moral or not moral. As such, the burden that I'm imposing on Emily isn't any different than the burden that she would have in any other debate round. But then, let's go to these specific standards in Emily's theory shell. Start on the offensive ground argument. First, I meet this standard. I say I am absolutely consistent with offensive ground insofar as she can just prove that skepticism being true is a reason to negate, not a reason to affirm. There's lots of really good arguments on this topic that explain why, if skepticism is true, we would not call something morally permissible. For example, because using the word moral would no longer make a ton of sense. Emily could have made those arguments. I shouldn't be punished just because she didn't do so. Second, if this argument is true, this justifies that if I'm reading the more fair interpretation, you should vote for me, because otherwise, I wouldn't be able to generate offense on theory, which she says is really important. Let's skip reciprocity for a second and go to the times view standard. First, this is absolutely ridiculous. She's negating. She has the times view. The affirmative, specifically the 1AR, is one of the hardest speeches in LD because my time is so pressed. I have to make a ton of arguments and I have to respond to a ton of substance. She doesn't have that problem. She has a ton of time to respond to the arguments that I'm making. For example, in her net speech, she'll have 6 minutes to respond to my 4 minutes. Second, I'd say that her running theory in the first place solves for this because I have to spend time on theory. Then, go down to the voter. Her argument in the voter says that you should drop the debater in order to establish norms for debate. However, if that's the case, you should vote for the person that endorses the most fair interpretation of debate. Essentially, her argument is that we're testing rules to be put in the debate rulebook. As such, you should vote for the debater that proposes the most fair rule. Lastly, go back up to the reciprocity argument. Even if it's true that I'm being irreciprocal, I'd say that the standards that I'm reading in the counter-interpretation are going to outweigh reciprocity on 2 levels. First, the textuality standard controls the internal link, or what it means for something to be reciprocal. This is the argument that's made very clearly in the textuality standard in the shell, i.e., what is fair on this topic is not necessarily what is fair on another topic. Second, I say that stable ground is going to be way more important than reciprocity. Even if the debate is really reciprocal, if the ground that we're debating on isn't stable, if it's not clear exactly what our advocacies are, then it's impossible for either debater to make arguments. As such, even if she's winning the reciprocity standard and I am being irreciprocal, it doesn't make sense to say that that's more important than the substantive violations that I'm reading in my book.
Okay. So one of the first phrases that Brian said was something made out of perfect. The A point of this shell, not an interpretation, but a counter-interpretation. So let's make them guess what that would mean, like why Brian chose to use that from us.
To show how the interpretation
so he is going to show how it's interpretation. But presumably the the negative shell is also showing how their interpretation is fair. So what's the difference in why it's called a counter? Yeah, and that's really essentially what it is. This is my interpretation that will counter back yours, emphasizing that this is an interpretation that is different from and necessarily exclusive of the negative interpretation. So like, cause like if the negative had read a shell that was the same shell, that was both all burdens must be sufficient for both behaviors, and then Brian gets up and says, well, my counter interpretation is the affirmative is not allowed to specify the resolution down to a single instant. What would the negative do in the NR? This is not so complicated. So, negative reads the shell, the app violates. Clearly, one of those burdens is a necessary but insufficient burden. And the app's like, yeah, but we shouldn't be allowed to specify things because that would be unfair and unpredictable. What's sort of odd about the app doing that? Yeah.
They're dropping the theory shell.
Yeah, they're dropping the other theory shell. And there's no reason why the other theory shell that they read, that the actual bill specify, even matters at all. So the importance of having a counter interpretation is that it's different from and exclusive with what the negative is saying. Because, so does anyone know what the text of Brian's counter interpretation was? Yeah.
That a debater may only establish one necessary but insufficient burden.
Yeah, and it's fine for the debater to have a single necessary but insufficient burden. So could it be true that both debaters must have both debaters may have a single necessary but insufficient burden, and that all burdens must be sufficient? No, that is definitely not possible. Both of those things to be true at the same time. So you can see this as a counter interpretation because it's exclusive from that original interpretation. And it's doing what Brian said at the cross. He's going to show a different rule and how that rule is more fair. So the first standard that Brian had was what? Can someone tell me what it was? Yeah.
I just have a question.
Yeah.
I was gonna ask, is it enough to affirm if he only wins her, if he only beats her theory show back and loses his, is that enough to affirm? Or does he have to beat her back and win his?
I'm so confused for what you mean by that.
Alright, because there's two theories. There's his counter interpretation, and then he puts all these arguments, why theory show, how the standards, they're wrong. Let's say he doesn't win with his theory show, because she's going to get up and is going to say, what's wrong with his standards, what's wrong with his theory show. And she proves how his standards are wrong in his counter interpretation. But at the same time, he beats back her theory show. What happens then?
Well, I think that the way you'd answer your question is related to sort of what I just talked about, that both of them couldn't be true. Because if Brian beats her show, that must mean that his interpretation is true. Because neither of them can be true at the same time. So if one is false, the other one seems to be true. And since those are the only two rules we have suggested for debate, we sort of have to pick one of those. So one of them is going to be better than the other. So I don't think you could have a situation that, like, he loses one or wins the other, but that doesn't establish, like, a clear rule for debate. Does that make sense to them? Okay.
Do all theory shells, like if somebody runs argument and wants some person to run a theory shell, and somebody runs a counter interpretation, all theory shells that have a theory and a counter interpretation are always going to be like one is true, the other is not, right?
For it to be an actual counter interpretation, yeah.
Then why do people run presume neg, presume app, or error app, or neg on theory arguments? If it's going to be one is true, if the other is not.
Well, it's because sometimes judges have a hard time evaluating theory. Because usually debaters wouldn't go quite this slowly when they're making theory arguments. They would go usually as fast as possible. Because judges who listen to theory also listen to speed. Listen to arguments very quickly. So a lot of times it just gets very difficult to evaluate theory debates, and if the judge is confused, oftentimes we'll go to like, which way should I just assume on theory debates? But we're getting a little bit distracted from what we're actually talking about. So, what was the first standard in the negative or affirmative counter interpretation? Yeah. Yeah, textuality to determine what is and is not fair. So, how is the affirmative being? Well, so how is the interpretation of the affirmative advocates supporting fairness in terms of textuality?
text and
Yeah, essentially. So there's the argument that statements have a bunch of assumptions. And then he's demonstrating how one of those assumptions is just necessary for the sufficient burden. That is still derived from the text of the resolution. Does anyone know what part of the case Brian would use to explain how he was being textual? This wasn't explicitly done in the counter interpretation. Yeah.
would be steps to argument?
Part 2?
Yes. That's what we're talking about, why that's the series preferred actually.
Well, so part 2 set up sort of like what's contention level offense, essentially, because he set up the burden for himself in the first part, and I was like, here's how I do the
the definition of moral person.
Yeah, I think that's more clearly where it would be, because he said that, well, resolution uses the phrase moral permissibility. Moral permissibility means there's no moral prohibition, therefore morality doesn't exist, I win. This is all derived from the text of the resolution. So then did anyone catch what the connection between textuality and variance is? Someone who yeah.
I'm not completely sure, but what is fair depends on the resolution?
Yeah. So like a fair case on this topic might be a self-defense agency. But if you read the self-defense agency on like the animal rights topic that was earlier this year, that was even not fair because, well, there's no idea. There's no way you can know this to be a topic in January, February, back in September. But also, that simply just isn't derived from the text of the resolution, so it's clearly not predictable in that sense. So, there's an argument that textuality frames what cases we think are fair or unfair. The second argument also seems somewhat interesting. This is an argument that he has the more stable advocacy. So anyone want to try to explain why that one necessary participation burden is a stable advocacy? There was like a A point. Does anyone have a guess for why?
What was the question?
How the interpretation that both bears may have one necessary participation burden provides for a stable grant. Do you have an answer?
That if he didn't have these necessary but insufficient burdens, he would be like a moving target, which is unfair for the negative because it's adequately predictable.
Why would he be a moving target?
Because you could just essentially do.
Can you be more specific?
The necessary but insufficient burdens, I don't know how to be more specific. Like the necessary but insufficient burdens would ground him in geographic to see that he can't just drop.
That's sort of the claim that's going on there. The specific A point is that it's not that necessary but insufficient burdens are negative link story, and B, that messy debates happen on substantive issues that won't really spread over onto necessary and insufficient burdens. So the way that what was your name again? Sam. The way that Sam explained this was that the person running the necessary and insufficient burden wouldn't be able to how did you phrase it? The stable advocacy argument.
That they wouldn't be able to just drop their advocacy.
Yeah, so the claim that they wouldn't be able to drop their advocacy. What was the negatives claim in the time skew argument specifically? What happens if the negative spends 6 minutes answering the skepticism position, saying that morality exists, then only spends 1 minute on their own position saying why their theory of morality would generate moral prohibitions against killing? The one AR would do what? Yeah. Yeah, they just attacked the one they spent the less time on. So what does that seem to imply that they would do, the arguments in the AC? Would they go for the arguments? Would they go for the arguments in the AC in that scenario? If they were just answering the negative conception of morality? That generate prohibition? Yeah, you could. You say your answer, Mike.
They just answer that one.
Yeah, the affirmative would just have to answer that single argument that this form of morality doesn't actually generate inequality, they wouldn't have to talk about determinative constructing. So it seems like this is perhaps a somewhat strange argument that interacts in an interesting way with some of the arguments that the negative shell established. Do you have a question?
Yeah. If Brian wins the theory argument, does he win the round?
Okay, so there were a couple of places Brian made arguments about that.
Okay.
So does anyone know what Brian said in the D point? Wasn't nearly as long as the D point in Emily's shell. Yeah, sure.
He said falsify Emily's initial voters for the theory show.
Yeah, and then he referenced what part of the debate that happened.
Can you say that again?
Brian falsified Emily's initial voters.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so he did that, and then he referenced that the cross-examination concession that Emily conceded that theory is a reverse voting machine.
Okay.
So that was when he was explaining that he wins this better interpretation. He's going to show his interpretation is more fair, that he wins the round. So, what kind of argument? So, where's the first place Brian attacked on the theory show that Emily read? Which one of the AB? Yeah, he attacked the violation. So, what was his argument there? But in the structure, what did it again? OB, yeah.
He said no abuse is occurring.
Yeah. He's making this argument that in every round, debaters have to overcome skepticism. This isn't anything all that unique. So this is an argument that there's really nothing bad is happening in the shell. So, does anyone know what the phrase terminal defense means?
Say that again?
Terminal defense, as opposed to regular defense. Some people in I talked about this in my lab, but I don't know if everyone else is covered. So, do you want to go?
I don't just guessing. I don't just guessing, but is it like if you probably win this one claim that argument is no longer valid? Like it's not just one defense. It's like this argument can't be brought up if not being voted anymore.
I think it's sort of a somewhat complicated way to explain it. I'm not quite sure what it is. We are sort of getting, so we only have like half an hour left. So very briefly, terminal defense is defense that means there's 0% chance that their argument is true. Then there's mitigatory defense, which is just sort of, there's a lesser probability the argument being true, but there's still some sort of risk that could happen.
I just have a quick question, because I was wondering something while talking about theory. Can you run multiple theory shells?
Yes, it seems like there's no reason why you couldn't.
Okay, so then would the debate just end up being, your opponent running the theory of why running a lot of theories is bad?
That could happen. Usually those debates get very messy, but it certainly is. So I'm going to do it.
I was just wondering if you're counter theory like this, if you have to write your own, counter theory shell right there with your, prep on.
Well, usually you can predict what theories are going to become an element of TDCs, and it's always better to have those written out very quickly. So let's move on to some of the arguments against the standards. So, Ryan made some defensive arguments against the first standard about offensive round, saying that Emily could make offensive arguments against the case. But I think the important thing to note here is that Brian didn't just say, well, he could turn the case by making arguments. He isolated specifically what arguments she could have made, and even gave an example of what one of those arguments was. She could say that, well, if morality doesn't exist and is incoherent, we could never say anything is morally permissible. It would just be merely permissible. Which is something that I think a lot of debaters fail to do in theory debates, is that when they're explaining, well, you could have made these arguments, they don't ever isolate specifically what these arguments are, or even just give an example of them. Because it seems fairly clear that it's sort of too late for everyone to be like, aha, he made an argument that turns his own case. Because Brian has gone all into the 1AR, in this particular on the theory debate, and he's trying to win there. So the substance debate seems to not really matter. Personally, we have the conceptual process that if he wins a better interpretation, he wins the round. So you can, it's perfectly fine to just give examples of arguments that can be made that would turn your position. And it's oftentimes important to do that to prove to judges, because some judges really don't think that there are arguments that skepticism could go the other way. It's important that you're pointing out, just giving examples of these arguments to prove that, yeah, you're probably doing examples. And then, so talking fairly briefly about the arguments against the reciprocity standard. So did Brian answer the analysis that he is being unreciprocal? Did he say that actually I am being very reciprocal? Okay.
He said that if you went to the other standards, they outweigh.
Yeah. This is another important thing to notice about the theory debate is that you can still weigh arguments within the theory. You can say how one particular standard is more important than other standards. Even the argument that we talked about before, that textuality is more important than reciprocity. Because even if we have a reciprocal debate, if the case is just not topical, meaning that the AC is about why hippopotamuses should eat crocodiles or something, you can still have a reciprocal debate about that. Maybe, if they shouldn't eat crocodiles, because they're nice little reptiles. But that still seems utterly absurd to expect the negative to be prepared to debate that, because it's nowhere near victims using deadly force in response to domestic violence. Yeah, and then his second argument is also very similar. Does anyone know what that argument is? How about you in the green shirt behind here? So do you know what the second argument Brian made against the reciprocity standard was?
Let's see. First, one of the arguments was that stable ground outweighed reciprocity.
Yeah, so what was the warrant for that?
He was talking about how an insufficient in advocacy is bad, and it's even worse than being unreciprocal.
Can you explain the warrant just a little bit more? Maybe just say it louder, so I don't think I heard you properly. So what was it that you said for why stable ground outweighs reciprocity?
Because an unstable advocacy is even less favorable than being unreciprocal.
So why is that?
That is true because the AC, or the affirmative can't, I just lost it.
Okay, someone want to try to help that? Yeah.
Okay, so it says that stable ground is more important because if there isn't stable ground, the debate is impossible to make arguments against for both sides. So if there's a restricting advocacy, it's hard for both sides to make arguments.
Yeah, so if someone has an unstable advocacy, no one can really have reciprocal ground, because if one person can just ignore that advocacy and ignore all their opponent's arguments, that doesn't matter if both debaters have equal ability to make those arguments, because one of those debated arguments are just going to be wholly irrelevant. So, the important thing to notice there is he's not explicitly contesting the warrants for why he's being unreciprocal, but he's just saying that those concerns don't really matter. Which is something you can do in the contention debate, just like in a regular round, where you just make arguments why one of their contentions, you don't have any good answers to it, it just doesn't matter at all, and how yours are more important. You do the same thing on the theory shelf. Because the theory debate still abides by the same rules that affect all other arguments. You can weigh them, you should weigh them, you can compare them, even if you don't have explicit answers to them. So, now we're ready to hear if everyone's had enough prep time.
So, as a brief roadmap, I'm going to begin by addressing Brian's counter-interpretation. So, that's this right now. After that, I'll be going to my own theory shelf. I'll be sure to signpost all the right things. Is everyone ready? Right. with Brian's first standard of textuality. The problem with this standard is that this begs the question of what the resolution actually means. The purpose for theory is for us to interpret how we should debate the resolution. So when he's saying that we have to look to a standard of textuality, he's literally saying we should debate the resolution by what the resolution is saying. That is incredibly circular, and it gives us no way to actually interpret the resolution. This means that his arguments about why the text of the resolution is necessary for us to look to fairness or education don't make sense, because he's giving us no mechanism in order to determine what is fair or what is educational. Remember, textuality literally means whatever the resolution says is what we should do, but the problem is that theory is supposed to tell us what we should do when it comes to the resolution. It gives us no way to adjudicate what is actually fair or what is actually educational. Now, let's go to the second standard of stable ground. First, by advocating for his counter-interpretation that we should both have one necessary but insufficient burden, he's actually decreasing the stable ground in this round, because there's no way for me to know if he will actually want to win this burden or go for some other argument. This means that I have no idea of what sort of ground that he is trying to have. At that point, I would say that my interpretation of theory that we should only have sufficient burdens is going to increase stable ground, because by that point we know that if we go for that argument, then that will be sufficient for us to win the round. Now, let's go to the interpretation, my full interpretation. So I'm going to begin by extending a few key parts of this theory shell. So, first you can extend the A point, which is the interpretation. When met, all burdens imposed on the debaters must be sufficient for the debaters to win the round. Now let's go to the B point, which is the violation. His argument against the violation is that he meets because everyone has to justify a moral framework and everyone has to overcome the step. First, it is incorrect to call this an I meet argument, because he's not saying that he is actually abiding by the interpretation, but rather he is saying that this interpretation isn't really a big deal. So, insofar as he's not really contesting at this point whether or not this is a good interpretation, this argument has no weight. But second, just saying that everyone has to do it doesn't mean that it is a fair thing for us to all have to do. Insofar as that there's no way for this part, there's no way for you to adjudicate this argument, because he's not saying that he's being more fair, he's just saying that this kind of sucks for everyone. Now, so you can extend the violation that I proposed, that in cross-examination, Brian made it very, very clear that I have to win two different arguments. The first being that I have to prove that moral statements can actually be made, and the second that my interpretation of morality would make deadly force impermissible. However, he only has to disprove either burden in order for the judge to vote for him. This means that I have two burdens that are not going to be enough for the two burdens that if I win either will not be enough for the judge to vote for me, but if he wins either will be enough for the judge to vote for him. So that is the violation, and the reason why he is not meeting the rule or the interpretation that I am setting up for this round. Now let's go to the C portion, which is standards. Remember, or I guess this was clarified in last speech, but none of the arguments that he makes against my standards are reasons for the judge to vote for him. They are all arguments as to why these standards might not be great. But I'm only going to extend one specific standard and show to all of you why this is a standard we should look to in the round. So, go to the second standard of reciprocity. His first argument against the standard is that textuality outweighs because textuality determines what is reciprocal. But you can cross-apply my argument that textuality literally means absolutely nothing when it comes to the resolutional interpretations, because textuality just says we should debate the resolution in order to determine what the resolution means. That doesn't make any sense, and that is incredibly circular. Then, his second argument is that stable ground is more important, because even if our burdens are reciprocal, we can't debate if our grounds are stable. But this doesn't make sense, because even if this is true, it wouldn't mean that one of us has an advantage over the other. This would only just mean that we are both on the same playing field, and even if that playing field kind of sucks because our grounds aren't really stable, we are still at the same level. I would say, however, that reciprocity would be more important than stable ground, because even if we had incredibly stable ground, but he had like 10 different ways to win and I only had one, that would still be very unfair for me. So let's extend this reciprocity argument. Burdens that must be met but are not sufficient to negate create a structural inequity in the round, because the affirmative wins the entire round if they win that one burden, whereas I have to both beat back that burden and win separate arguments to win the round. This destroys fairness, because the negative will always have to do significantly more in the round to win, meaning that an affirmative debater equal skill will almost always win the round if they run such an argument. So, in order to clarify why we have to look to reciprocity, he's only giving you these two different weighing mechanisms. But remember, textuality does not matter because textuality itself is not a way to adjudicate what ought to be fair or what ought not to be fair. And second, you always prefer reciprocity over stable ground because even if our ground is incredibly stable, and he has 10 different ways to win, and I only have one, that is obviously still very unfair. Whereas if we both don't have stable ground, but we have the same amount of unstable ground, unstable ground, then that you would still be on the same playing level, even if that playing level kind of sucks. So that doesn't mean that one of us has a structural advantage over the other. It just means that we are not having the greatest debate ground. So I'm only extending this one standard because none of the other standards actually matter in this round anymore. He's not giving you any reasons as to why he's doing a better job in achieving those standards, rather just these standards are great. So finally, let's extend the last portion of the theory shell, which is the voter. We both agree on the voter fairness, so I'm just going to extend a few reasons why fairness is important. That the fairness is important because the purpose of the judge is to determine who did the better debating. But the problem is that if one of us enters the round or if one of us has a structural advantage within the round, there is no way for the judge to know if that person was actually the better debater or if that person just had an advantage. And finally, you can extend the argument that if I win my interpretation is the most fair, then I should win the round because the purpose of this theory is to generate the better norms for our debates. And if I'm showing that my norm is the better, or if my rule should be the better norm, then I should win the round in order to deter bad arguments like necessary and insufficient burdens from being drawn. So let's summarize what this all means. Remember that I am extending my original theory shell, giving you reasons why you ought to prefer my standard of reciprocity over any standard that he's proposing.
Okay. So, there was a lot of arguments that Emily dropped in that speech. She didn't really explain how necessary and insufficient burdens take away offensive ground. Didn't explain how they skew her time in any particular way. So, is there anything that Brian could take advantage of in those particular arguments? Did you do something? Yeah.
The time skew, because he as the AC, he has the hardest speech to give because she has that 6 minutes or 7 minutes to give the theory shell and attack his case, while he only has 4 minutes to answer that.
So that's an explanation of how the app is usually a time skew. So what was the implication Brian made off of that argument? Yeah.
The implication was that he doesn't know whether or not she's actually going to go for this argument or the standard of time skew in her next speech. Therefore, if she doesn't go forward, it could generate a reason why this time would still be skewed against him in the theory debate.
I think that's getting close to it, but it's not quite for Brian being able to get something about that in the theory. Sarah?
Well, he also said that when she runs theory, this solves for time skew because he has to spend time on it.
So you clarified that argument as defensive or offensive?
I don't know.
Okay, so is that reason why Brian's interpretation makes for less time skew? Yeah, it's not really an offensive reason as to how each debater having one necessary insufficient burden makes time more applicable. So the first argument could maybe be phrased in such a way as to do that. So the first argument was that he, as the affirmative, is always in a time skew. So if he's countering that back, that could be an argument for why he is rectifying some unfairness that already existed structurally within the debate round. Because the affirmative usually is pressed for time, but in this scenario, the negative might be slightly more pressed for time. So then what were some of the arguments Emily made against the counter-interpretation? So her argument against the textuality standard is a response, and it's something that happens very frequently within theory. So what was Emily's response to that? So what's her argument about why textuality is a bad thing?
She says that it's circular. it still begs the question of the resolution.
Yeah, so her point is that we're using theory to interpret the resolution. It doesn't really make sense to say I'm being resolutional when we're talking about and trying to weigh what would be better resolutional interpretation. So again, something to notice that similar to the way that Brian attacked the reciprocity standard, is Emily contesting that his arguments are textual? How about the person sitting behind Cat next to Vic? So, is Emily contesting that Brian is making a textual interpretation? Is Emily contesting whether Brian's interpretation that both debaters can have one necessarily burden textual or not?
She's saying that it's
well, she's not. So she is agreeing that the interpretation is textual. Her argument against the textuality standard is not that necessary insufficient burdens actually can be derived from a resolution. It's just that, well, just because you can derive something from a resolution, that doesn't mean that it is fair. Because we're supposed to be trying to determine which is the most fair interpretation of the debate. So, similar to what happened with Brian's arguments of reciprocity, this is just sort of like a weighing metric. She's trying to say, well, your standard doesn't matter, even if I actually violate it. So, it's important to know that you can attack standards on at least two different levels every time you're debating a theory trial. You can either contest how their interpretation supports that standard, or you can contest the internal link between that standard and the voter, usually, preferably, in the form of saying how one of your standards is better or outweighs. So that's then giving you the additional benefit of making your arguments more important at the expense of theirs. So we are still going to be a little bit pressed for time at the end, but so we now listen to the 2AR, try to see how this theory debates, and we're wrapping up.
Alright, so we're going to be starting on my counter-interpretation. Then we'll go to the initial shell that I have. Is everyone ready? Instead of the counter-interpretation, which says that debaters may establish one and only one necessary but insufficient burden. Then extend the B point, which says that I am consistent with this interpretation because the affirmative case only establishes one necessary but insufficient burden for the negative. Then let's go to the standards. I'll concede her responses to the textuality standard. Let's go to the stable ground argument. Emily's only response to stable ground is that I am decreasing stable ground. But this argument is just not true. First, this appeals to the notion of reciprocity. But I'm going to be extending arguments out of my standard justification, which explains why stable advocacy ground is more important than reciprocity in the first place. Second, there's no reason given in the last speech as to why we can't just adjudicate between our competing necessary but insufficient burdens. Even if it's true that we can both establish necessary but insufficient burdens, we can still weigh between those. Third, this just ignores the internals of my argument. Specifically, I give two justifications as to why I increase stable ground by having a necessary but insufficient burden in the affirmative case, and in fact, by having the affirmative case consist almost entirely of necessary but insufficient burden. So, with that in mind, extend the stable ground standard. Extend that a necessary but insufficient burden is literally the most stable piece of offense that I can generate because A, it's not at all dependent on the negative link story, and B, the messy debate that tends to happen on other substantive issues can't take the debate that happens on the necessary but insufficient burden of the affirmative case. Then, extend why stable ground is key to fairness. Namely, because an unstable advocacy makes me into a moving target, skewing Emily's strategy and making it impossible for her to make cogent responses to my argument. So, that's the internal link to fairness, which I'll be getting to in a second. But then, extend why stable advocacy comes before any other theory standard. Because even if the round is reciprocal, if advocacies aren't clear and stable, it's impossible for either debater to make arguments. Emily is only going for the reciprocity arguments on her initial shell, so this is going to aid me in weighing against those arguments. Lastly, go down and re-extend the cross-application of Emily's fairness code. Remember, we are trying to determine who has the most fair interpretation. So, at the end of the day, if I'm showing you that my interpretation is more fair, you would vote for me. I've already shown you why my interpretation is fair, but now I will weigh against the interpretation that Emily's on. With that in mind, go to her interpretation. She only extends reciprocity. She has two responses on these stable grounds is more important. First, she says that we're both on the same plane. That's exactly my argument. When we consider stable ground first, we naturally end up in a reciprocal state. Her second argument is that it would be really abusive if I had 10 ways to win and she only had 1. But my interpretation doesn't allow that to occur, because I say that each debater only gets 1 necessary but sufficient verb. So, here's the way the round breaks down. I'm extending the stable advocacy argument coming out of the negative case. Furthermore, I'm extending the drop justification as to why that stable advocacy argument comes prior to reciprocity, and I'm getting back the reciprocity arguments coming out of Emily's shell. It is a very clear affirmative ballot.
So, I think you saw an excellent example of how to not only have a theory debate, but have one that is actually understandable. So how many arguments did this debate come down to in terms of how many standards matter at the end of the round? Well, look how many fingers for how many All right, yeah, you're all right. They just came down to 2 standards. So the reciprocity versus this idea of narrowing the neck, the bird is going for stable ground. So you guys should all keep your clothes out because we're still talking.
Hey, yeah, stop packing up.
Yeah. So a lot of the times what happens in theory debates is that people are like, oh, I have all these arguments. I'm going to go for every single one of them. Just like if you did that in a contention debate, when you're just having a regular discussion about the issues of the resolution, that would get very unclear to the judge. Because if you're always extending arrows across the floor, you're like, I have all these arguments. Look at all these details I'm generating. That would become very difficult for judges to evaluate because there's so many arguments, it's difficult to compare all of them at once. But when the round just collapsed down to these 2 issues, it's very clear because Emily and Brian were able to do a lot of work weighing between these different theory arguments and comparing them, talking about why one standard was more important than the other. And the other thing to notice about this is that in every speech, they extended the explicit wording of their interpretation. This is another thing that oftentimes is like very difficult for people who are new to theory, especially when they're initiating it themselves, is that there are a lot of very technical things you have to do in terms of the extension of arguments. A lot of times judges want you to extend exactly what the wording of the interpretation was in the speech. And they'll just not vote for you if you forget to spend at like 2 or 3 seconds just rereading the interpretation. So it's always important that you remember to do that. So you should also write this down. Always extend the wording of the interpretation. Always extend the explicit, or exact, wording of the interpretation in every speech you go into theory. You need to do this. So there are judges who will just ignore your arguments if you forget to do that. So, it's also important to note that they also extended, even though they were both conceding in most of the speeches, the internal links between a lot of the times, they were both conceding the voter arguments, they still re-articulated those to make sure that the judge had the full ballot story coming into their round, that what their interpretation was, why it's preferable, and why it's a voting issue, and why it should be different. The fundamental focus of this thing. So, are there any specific questions you guys have about the arguments that were just made in this regard? Okay. So why do you think that Brian chose to go for the second standard of stable ground as opposed to the textuality one, even though the textuality argument was uncontested in terms of why he was being textual? If he was just, yeah.
Stable ground, like, yeah, reciprocity.
So he was making a claim that stable ground outweighs reciprocity, but he's also making a claim that textuality also precludes reciprocity, because even if the case is reciprocal, if it's not related to the topic, you still wouldn't call it fair. So I think something more nuanced than that. So what was Emily's argument against stable ground? Yeah.
Like, she was conceding that she was saying that he was textual. That's all well and good, but it doesn't matter because textuality shouldn't be a legitimate standard. We're talking about theory. So he asks what it used to be.
So that's a good explanation of what Emily's argument was against the textuality standard. But did another argument was against the stable ground standard?
That she actually doesn't, it's not actually stable because she doesn't know where he's going to go with the necessary defense.
Yeah. So once again, would you call that argument offensive or defensive? What do you say?
Defensive.
Why is it defensive? Does everyone agree with that? That you couldn't win out this argument?
No, because she explicitly said reciprocity outweighs stable ground, which brought the idea that even if we're reciprocal, if he has 10 ways to win and I have 1, that's not right. Even if he has stable ground, if he has 10 ways to win and I have 1, that's not reciprocal.
So but that doesn't rely on her winning this argument. Because it seems, well, so, do you have a
She turned down making it offensive for herself because she said that necessary but insufficient burdens are actually less stable.
Yeah, I would agree with that interpretation. I don't think you said like the explicit word term which make this argument, but it was certainly often an offensive claim that necessary but insufficient burdens actually make the debate much more unstable because he can just pick out the arguments and ignore the AC and just answer the arguments that she would have read in a negative case that the morality that exists would actually prohibit use of deadly force. So, since Brian has to go for theory, because that was the only argument in the 1AR, he would still have to say something against this argument. Because this is an offensive reason as to why Ellen's interpretation is better in terms of his own standards. So it's independent. This would be an argument that would presumably be sufficient for her to win the round because she's turned his argument in an offense for her. Because she's saying how she's actually improving stable ground because if both debaters have sufficient burdens, you couldn't just ignore all of your opponent's arguments because they have offense linking back to the burden you established, then that would be sufficient for them to win the round. You couldn't just ignore those claims. So, if Brian had wanted to go to the textuality argument, even though it was conceded that he was being textual, he still would have had to answer this argument because it is an offensive reason to reject his counterinterpretation. It's a reason why debaters running necessary but insufficient burdens is bad for stable ground. People could just ignore lots of arguments on the flow. So, it seems like he almost had to go with stable ground in this scenario because he has to answer this argument against it. If you wanted to go for textuality, you'd have to answer this argument and the argument he placed against textuality that's not a legitimate concern because that's still a defensive argument as a standard and he wants to go for it, he has to answer that back. But if he's just going for stable ground, he only has to answer one of her arguments because that's the one, so that's the only offensive argument. He still has to answer that and then he gains access to stable ground. So I want to explain back to me why it is that he probably succeeded to go for stable ground. Yeah.
The arguments that she made was the arguments that you went for were offensive arguments. And so if you wanted to win, you would have to take out her offense. Because if you still had offense in the round, she would win.
So the arguments that she placed against his shell were offense on that particular standard. So they'd have to answer that. And it would just be additional burdens on if you wanted to go for textuality. And then the final thing about the theory debate was Emily's weighing argument that I think you mentioned before actually, but how even if the 10 versus 1 example. So what was that argument? This was yeah.
It was that they could still have stable ground, but then he could still have like 10 outs as opposed to her 1 out.
Yeah, so this was weighing between which two things.
Oh, reciprocity and stable ground.
Yeah, so this is an argument where reciprocity is more important than stable ground, because even if he has 10 stable ways to win, and she has 1, that's still probably pretty bad. What was Brian's response to this? Okay.
That the interpretation was kind of interpretation he just doesn't allow for it to.
Yeah, Brian used the specificity of his counter-interpretation to get out of this argument, because his interpretation simply wouldn't allow for a 10 versus 1 scenario. So it's important to note that, like we talked about in the lecture, that it's important to spend a lot of time writing your theory violations, because the specificity of them gets you out of a lot of common arguments. The argument that like they could have 10 ways to win, whereas I would have to go, whereas I could only have 1, is a very common argument people make against necessary and insufficient burdens, because they assume that the counter-interpretation that the person defending necessary and insufficient burdens is going to go with is that just a very generic statement that, well, necessary and insufficient burdens are perfectly okay. You can run as many of them as you want. But that's really not what Brian is saying. He's saying that each debater can only have a single necessary and insufficient burden. So, then that important distinction gets him out of this argument. It makes it a lot easier, I think, for him to go for the type of weight analysis. He can just sort of easily take out that argument that Emily's making. So then it is 9 o'clock. And it's time. Is there any other questions? Feel free to ask me or everyone.